Welcome to the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation's Meet the Scientist monthly webinar series. I'm Dr. Jeff Borenstein, BBRF's President and CEO. Today, Dr. Daniel Abrams will present Helping Children with Autism Tune into Voices. BBRF is the world's largest private funder of mental health research grants, supporting transformative discoveries in order to develop improved treatments, cures, and methods of prevention. The high quality of the research we fund is made possible by the BBRF Scientific Council. This group of over 190 prominent mental health researchers reviews each grant application and selects the most promising ideas with the greatest potential to lead to breakthroughs. The Scientific Council guides the foundation to fund creative and impactful research. Since 1987, the foundation has awarded over $475 million to fund more than 6,800 research grants around the world across a broad spectrum of brain conditions, including addiction, ADHD, anxiety, autism, bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, depression, eating disorders, OCD, post-traumatic stress, schizophrenia, as well as suicide prevention. Today, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Daniel Abrams. Dr. Abrams is a clinical associate professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences and director of the Speech and Social Neuroscience Lab at Stanford University. He is a BBRF 2018 Young Investigator grantee. Our webinar will begin with Dr. Abrams' presentation, which will then be followed by a Q&A. Please feel free to submit your questions at any time. Following the presentation, I'll ask as many questions as time allots. And now, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Abrams. Dan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Jeff. I'm truly grateful not only for the opportunity to speak with you all today, but also for the support that the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation provided earlier in my career as I was transitioning into a faculty position here at Stanford. That support helped launch and shape the research program I'll be sharing with you all today, work aimed at understanding how the brain processes voices and how that may relate to communication differences in children with autism. And so I'd like to start my talk with a little bit about my career trajectory and how I wound up studying the neuroscience of voice processing in kids with autism. And so I'm a lifelong musician. I still play music all the time. I play a couple of instruments, not particularly well, but I'm a passionate musician. It's been kind of a lifelong love of mine. And so I've always been interested in sound, starting from when I was a kid and started playing the music. And during college, I took an interest in sound production. I worked in recording studios. I did live sound for concerts and stage and theater. And this moved me towards acoustics. And my first job out of college was measuring the acoustical properties of loudspeakers for a concert loudspeaker manufacturer. And then I followed my nose a little bit more and wound up studying, and my kind of next job was in acoustics. I worked for an acoustical engineering firm. Acoustical engineers are people that work with architects to provide recommendations about the spaces that they're designing to ensure that they kind of meet standards for acoustics, so that everyone can hear each other and they're not overshadowed by air handlers and various noise sources. And so, yeah, so after being an acoustical engineer for a while, I realized I needed to pivot. And I knew all this stuff about sound and acoustics, and I wanted to find a way to apply it to human health and have an impact in people's lives. And so I became interested in hearing. And the more I learned about hearing, the more I became interested in the brain. And so I got my PhD studying what's called auditory neuroscience. This is the neuroscience of hearing. How does the brain help us make sense of the sounds that we hear in our everyday lives? And through the years of studying the brain, my work has gravitated towards studying voice processing. So why should we study the voice? Well, the voice is this really important signal in our everyday lives that helps us instantly feel connected to the people around us. So I'm going to ask you to kind of step away from, it's kind of hard to see our social world sometimes. We're so ingrained in it. It's so kind of deeply in the fabric of our everyday lives that it's sometimes a little bit hard to kind of see exactly what it is that we do when we're socializing. And I'll ask you to kind of take a step back and just think about what the voice does. When you hear the voice of a loved one, one of your kids or a parent, you feel this instant connection with them. And so the voice is this kind of primitive and early signal for us, an important signal for us to feel affiliation and connectedness with the people that are important to us, from our family to our friends, caregivers, and the like. And hearing the voices of our loved ones is a rewarding experience. Again, I know we don't really think about it very much because it's just maybe not something we really focus on in our everyday lives. But when you hear a loved one, say it's a just stressful moment or something comes up and you need to talk to someone that you're close to, hearing their voice, not just getting a stream of words from them, but actually the acoustical features of their voice is a soothing and can be a rewarding signal in our everyday lives. And of course, the voice also is important for communication. It provides a vehicle for us to express our thoughts and feelings, for us to teach other people and learn from others. And so it's an important signal for everyday communication. And the voice, transmits all different kinds of information, from what someone is saying to who is saying it, and to and also how that person feels when they're speaking, because we can detect from people's voices how people feel. The statement, it's not what you say, but how you say it. So the voice provides all kinds of information. Our brain is able to make sense of all this information in general effortlessly. And so babies' brains are built to tune into voices from the earliest stages of development. And so when I teach classes in this area, I always ask the question of the class, and it's kind of a trick question, but the question is, how old do you think a child is when they're first able to recognize their mother's voice? And the reason it's a trick question is because it's been shown that fetuses in utero are able to recognize their mother's voice. So it's before they're even born. And it's also been shown in other research that newborns in the first days of life are able to identify their mother's voice. And so this tells us something really profound about how the brain is wired for sound and for voices in particular from the very earliest stages of development. We are tuned into voices so early in our development. I think this tells us, evolution has built a system and built a brain for us that can do this. This must be important for survival, and here our brains are wired for this. And we think that, anyone who spent any time with an infant will know that that babies listen to you and are engaged by vocal sounds well before they know what any of it means. So babies will follow a conversation between two people with, they'll be watching with their little eyes. And again, they have no idea what you're saying, but they're locked in to voices. And this engagement, again, just starts from such an early stage of development. And we think that this initial engagement with voices and this kind of attraction to vocal sounds is critical for important kind of linguistic milestones. For example, babies aren't born knowing all of the different speech sounds in a language. For example, when a baby is born, they can't discriminate pa from ta from ka. They have to learn this during development. And we think that this kind of initial attraction to voices helps draw kids into language so that they can begin to discriminate these these different speech sounds. And once they've learned to discriminate these sounds, they often start imitating these speech sounds through babbling. And then after that, they learn to attribute meaning to speech sounds. And so we think this kind of initial kind of attraction and tuning in to voices that starts from these very early stages of development is critical for helping to build language and in kids. And so a fundamental question that my lab addresses is, how does the brain understand voices? And how might this work differently in autistic children? And so this is an important question in the context of autism, because many kids with autism struggle to tune into the vocal world. And this is so prominent in autism that it's part of the DSM description for autism. And also, before getting an autism diagnosis, many parents notice that their child isn't tuning into the voice. And for example, when someone calls the child's name, often they don't respond. And parents initially may think that they may have a hearing impairment that they, for example, that a hearing aid could fix. This often leads to a trip to the pediatrician and maybe to the audiologist to have a hearing exam. And for many of these kids, hearing, an audiological exam will reveal that hearing is largely intact, like what we call the peripheral, hearing organ, your ear, your cochlea is doing its job. And therefore, there's another reason that kids with autism they are not tuning into voices. And so examining these questions and understanding what the brain differences are in kids with autism that kind of prohibit them from tuning into voices is a fundamental question that my lab addresses. And so now I'm going to tell you a little bit about brain systems for voice processing. Oh, sorry, quick little recap of why studying voices matters, excuse me. So first, to understand how the brain supports speech and social connection, and to identify brain systems that shape communication differences in autism. And finally, to help guide future approaches to support communication and social connection. So, as I said before, now I'm going to teach you a little bit about brain systems for voice processing. And so sounds are, the sounds that we hear are sound pressure waves that travel through the ear and through the air. And our ear does this magical thing, which is to translate these sound pressure waves in the air into neural impulses that get directed up to our brain. And here's a picture of the cortex. I'm sure you've all seen this before. This is the kind of large wrinkly structure on the outside of the brain. And I'll orient you, here's the front of the brain, here's the back of the brain, and I've highlighted this blue structure here, which is called auditory cortex. This is on the side of the brain, not too far from the ear, actually. And the auditory cortex is an important structure because it's the first brain structure at the level of cortex that receives its input from the ear. And so the ear directs its neural impulses, and the first stop in the cortex that it reaches is called auditory cortex. And part of auditory cortex, the part that my cursor is highlighting right now, is sensitive to all different sounds that the ear detects. It doesn't care if it's a car driving by, or a train, or music, or speech, or bird chirping, or whatever. Part of auditory cortex is highly sensitive to all different sounds. And another part of auditory cortex, which I'm highlighting down here, is selective for voices in particular, even more so than all other sounds. And given the behavioral importance of voices, it makes sense that part of our brain would be particularly sensitive to vocal sounds. So this is what I kind of consider at the highest level the hearing brain. This is our auditory part, an important part of our auditory brain. But there's far more to making sense of speech and voices than just this auditory region. We have this rest of our brain here, and there are other brain systems that support social interactions. For example, we have what's called a reward system. And now we're looking at the brain. Here's the front of the brain. Here's the back of the brain. We're kind of looking down on the brain now. And it's what we call a glass brain, so you can kind of see through it. And I've highlighted these structures in green. And these structures are what are called the reward system. And this is a system in that's a very important part of our brain that is highly active during the anticipation and experience of all kinds of rewarding signals in our lives, from food to drugs to music to all different kinds of things that can stimulate the reward system. And social interactions are often highly rewarding, and we know that the reward system can become active during social interactions. Another part of the brain that's important for social interactions is what's called the salience network. That's a different set of structures that I've highlighted in purple here. And this part of the brain and this network of brain regions is important for detection of important social cues. So it detects these kind of salient social cues in our lives. And we have a third network that I'm highlighting in red here, which we'll call the social evaluation network. It's more formally known as what's called the default mode network, and it's in red. And this part of the brain is important for making sense of our social world, for when you think about an email or think about what someone said or reflect on some kind of social event in our life, we think about this as being performed by these brain structures in red in what I'll call the social evaluation network. And we know that the auditory cortex has important connections to all of these different brain regions to kind of help us make sense of the vocal world. For example, vocal reward is thought to be processed by interactions between our auditory regions and our reward system in green here. And detecting salient voices is thought to be performed in the brain through important connections between our auditory cortex and the salience network. And processing of vocal emotion and evaluating vocal information for its social content. Like, for example, when someone's happy or sad, you can detect those vocal cues. And we're able to, again, it's not what you say, but how you say it. We're able to identify people's emotional states through it's partially, in part through these connections between our auditory cortex and our social evaluative processing regions here. So, so we have all of these different important connections in our brain that we think allow us to kind of make sense of the vocal world. And so now I'd like to take you through a series of experiments that my lab has conducted, highlighting different elements of voice processing in neurotypical children and children with autism. So we started this line of research with a kind of a fairly straightforward question. How does a child's brain recognize the mother's voice? Believe it or not, no one had really done this study. And in order to examine this question, we designed a straightforward study where we had children listen to both mother's voice and unfamiliar voices. And in order to capture mother's voice, we brought each child's mother into the lab before the fMRI experiment, before the brain experiment. And we coached each mom how to say very particular things in very particular ways. And we recorded their voice and then chopped it up and got it ready for our fMRI experiment. And we also had women who were unfamiliar to the children make the exact same vocal recordings, and we did the exact same processing to the voices. And so that turned into our control condition in our experiment. And so just to give you a sense of what the vocal stimuli were for this mother's voice versus unfamiliar voices study, we used what are called nonsense words as stimuli. Nonsense words are exactly what they sound like. They're words that sound like they could be words in the English language, they just don't mean anything. And the reason we used nonsense words in the experiment was because we didn't want any semantic associations to take place during the brain experiment. For example, if we had moms say words like airplane or automobile, and then kids heard this during the brain experiment, in some cases, some kids may love cars and planes, and other kids may be really frightened of them. And we weren't interested in any of the kind of semantic associations with vocal stimuli. We just wanted to study the voice. And so we used these nonsense words to kind of eliminate any of these kind of semantic associations that a kid might have. And so the stimuli were relatively brief. Each of these nonsense words were about a little under a second. And we carefully controlled all the stimuli so that they were all the exact same duration and the exact same loudness between our mothers and our unfamiliar voices, so that none of those kind of acoustical factors would play into our brain results. And so now I'm gonna share with you some of the results, and I'm gonna have a moment of candor, which is that initially we really didn't think this would result in a very strong brain result. You know, in lots of auditory studies, when you carefully control for how loud the two sounds will be, and how long the two sounds will be, or the two classes of sounds will be, usually there isn't a big kind of neural difference. And so we weren't prepared for a very big neural processing difference between our mother's voice and unfamiliar voices, but it turned out we were wrong about that. Now I'm going to show you a slide with a whole bunch of brains on it. And on top of the brains, there are some orange and yellow colors. And for all those areas that have orange and yellow colors, those represent parts of the brain that show greater neural activity for mother's voice compared to unfamiliar voices saying the exact same thing. Oh, whoopsie, excuse me. And so here are the results from that study. And what results show is that mother's voice activates not only hearing parts of the brain, but also social and reward networks in the brain. So here are pictures of the brain, and here's our auditory cortex. This is a different view of auditory cortex than I showed you before. But you can see here's this orange color, and this shows us that these hearing parts of the brain had greater activity for mothers compared to unfamiliar voices. And this extended into our voice recognition regions, and also into all of these other brain systems, including our reward system, our social evaluation system, the salience network, and even face processing regions in occipital cortex. Please note, the kids were not seeing any faces during the experiment. They were just hearing voices, but it was still sufficient to activate these face processing regions in occipital cortex, and also in our motion processing regions in the amygdala. And so what this result shows us is that hearing a mother's voice in a child, you know, when a child hears a mother's voice, and neurotypical children hear mother's voice, it sends signals all around the brain, including to not only hearing parts of the brain, but also all of these other brain regions that are important for making sense of our social world. And so we thought this was fascinating, and my colleague Vinod Menon and I scratched our heads and thought, well, what's a cool next experiment? And we decided, you know, adolescence is this really interesting and amazing period of social development, right? So in adolescence, kids have this onslaught of hormones, and their social world kind of turns upside down. They start really focusing on peers, and the social world becomes much more intense. And so we thought, you know, here we've got this cool experiment. Let's study older kids. So the first group of kids in the results that I'm showing you here are from 7 to 12-year-old kids. And we thought, well, let's bring in a bunch of teenagers. So we brought in kids from 13 to 17 years old and did the exact same experiment. We recorded each child's mom, and then cut up and process the vocal signals the exact same way. And then we brought the kids in and had them listen to the exact same sounds, their mother's voice and unfamiliar voices. And we measured the exact same brain responses, but in the brain analysis, we examined whether there are age-related differences in how the brain is processing voices in neurotypical kids. And here are some results from that. And what it shows is that in adolescence, the brain shifts from a mother's voice preference to new voice preferences in reward and social evaluative processing regions. So I'm going to zoom in on one of these scatter plots so you can see what it is that I'm talking about here. So let me orient you. Each circle here represents a different participant. And I plotted age on the x-axis. So here are 7-year-olds and here's 17-year-olds. And then I plotted neural activation for non-familial compared to mother's voice. So the negative values below 0 here will show a preference for mother's voice, and the values above 0 will show a preference for non-familial voices. And what we see is that as kids there's an age-related switch that occurs in kids, whereas younger kids are more tuned into moms and older adolescents are more tuned into non-familial female voices compared to mom. And so this tells us something really important, which is as social demands change in an adolescent's life, their brains, in particular in social evaluative and reward regions, track these preferences and track these changes. And there's this important shift that occurs as kids start to focus more on non-familial communication partners. So, all of this was super interesting. And as I obviously mentioned at the beginning of the talk, we're very much focused on kids with autism. And so, and given the prominence and given how challenging it can be for kids with autism to tune into voices in their environment, we perform the exact same experiments in kids with autism. And now I'll show you some of those results. So, the first study I'll show you is in children with autism. And we ask the question, how does the autistic brain respond to a mother's voice? And in this case, children listen to both mother's voice and unfamiliar voices, the exact same experiment that I've kind of shown you before. First, we did this in 7 to 12-year-old children. And the results from the study showed that voice processing differences in autism were linked to interactions between auditory cortex and multiple social brain systems. So as I've mentioned previously, we think that these connections between auditory cortex and the reward, salience, and social evaluative processing regions are critical for making sense of our of voices. And the brain results from our study in kids with autism highlighted that these particular connections were important, not only for distinguishing kids with autism from neurotypical children, but also to predict social communication ability within kids with autism. So the social communication encompasses a very broad set of behaviors that can be assessed. It includes visual face processing and eye contact and joint attention and gestures and theory of mind, understanding what other people think, and voice processing is only one part of this very big picture of social communication and autism. But we think it's an important part of that bigger picture social communication kind of domain. And so the reason that result is important is because our results showed that these particular connections between voice processing and these other brain systems, social brain systems, predicted social communication ability within autism. So and so this tells us, kind of suggests that voice connections in the brain are important in the broader context of social communication and autism. And so in the next study we did, which is currently under review, so it's still kind of preliminary evidence, but we performed the exact same study in adolescents with autism to track age-related change in autism and to see if they showed similar patterns as the neurotypical kids did. And now I'll show you those results. And so again, these are preliminary results. They haven't been published, but they're under review. And what the results show is the developmental shift towards new voices appears altered in autism. So let me orient you again. Here we're looking at part of the reward system in the brain. This is a structure called orbitofrontal cortex. And let me zoom in on our scatter plot. So it's the same scatter plot as you saw before, where we have age on the x-axis, and in this case, we have non-familial voice processing on the y-axis. And again, the circles are neurotypical kids, and the black line is their trend line. And the X's are kids with autism. And and the gray line here is the autism trend line. And what you can see is there are differences in the age-related relationship between between kids with autism and neurotypical kids. Whereas neurotypical kids are showing this uptick across age for processing non-familial voices, kids with autism often show either a flat line or in some cases even a negative slope, suggesting that they're across age, they're showing less, their brains are engaging less with unfamiliar voices. And so this tells us something important. We think this tells us something important about age-related change in autism, and that these developmental patterns that appear to be set up in neurotypical kids are not being followed in the autistic brain. And so here I've shown you a series of experiments related to voice processing, and in particular studying, quote, who is speaking, mother's voice and unfamiliar voices. And we've, carefully designed those previous studies to use very small chunks of speech, actually meaningless speech. And obviously that tells us something important about communication, but there's far more to human communication than just kind of identifying who is speaking. There's, of course, what are those people saying, the kind of what question in the context of speech understanding. And so a new research direction that my lab has taken in the last few years has been to examine the integration of speech over time. And so as you listen to me speak, you need to hold information in your working memory as your brain gathers new speech. So if you didn't understand what I said 15 seconds ago, or 30 seconds ago, or a minute ago, you're probably going to have trouble understanding what I'm saying right now. And our brain is able to effortlessly hold information in working memory as it gathers new information, and then integrate it all over time to understand meaning. And so the idea is that speech unfolds over multiple words and sentences, and that the brain integrates this information across time to understand meaning. And we designed a study to examine how these processes work in neurotypical and autistic children. And so now I'll provide a few details of the study in neurotypical and autistic children. We asked, how does the autistic brain integrate speech over time? And so children listen to two conditions. They listen to meaningful stories with coherent narratives. These were told by kids and by adults. They're about 3 to 4 minute long stories where kids would, their personal stories told by these kids about something that happened in their life. It could have been happy, it could have been sad. And so that was one of the conditions, this coherent narrative condition. And in another condition, we used scrambled speech, where we took the exact same recording of from the meaningful stories, and we reordered the words so that it no longer made any sense. So it's kind of a coarse, but a good acoustical control, in that all of the sounds across the two conditions are the same. They're all the same words, but one is ordered in a way that makes sense and produces a coherent narrative, and the other makes no sense. It's just a word scramble, and there's no way to integrate that information over time. And so we measured fMRI, brain activity during both of these conditions and compared the two. And this experiment allows us to identify brain regions that integrate speech information over longer timescales. And so now I'll show you some preliminary results where this work is still in preparation. And what results show is that children with autism showed reduced integration of speech across time. So we focused our analysis on the speech evaluation network, also known as the default mode network. And the reason we focused on this is we think that important aspects of social cognition occur in this particular brain network. And it's been shown in healthy adults that that this particular brain network is important for integration of speech over time. And so this is how we focus the analysis. And now I'll show you some of the brain results. And let me orient you first. So on the x-axis, we have responses to the original narrative, the coherent narrative condition. And on the right side, we have neural responses to the scrambled condition. And then on the y-axis, we're plotting social brain responses measured from the social evaluation network here in red. And first, I'll show you results from the scrambled condition. And so blue, these dots here, and the blue is neurotypical, typically developing kids, and the red is kids with autism. And you can see that for the scrambled condition, that there's very little integration going on in our default mode network here, in our social evaluation network, for either neurotypical kids or kids with autism. There's nothing to integrate. The story doesn't make sense because it's not a story, it's just a bunch of scrambled words. And so there's nothing to kind of put together in the brain there. But when we looked at the original narrative condition, we saw a very different pattern, which is that neurotypical kids showed this increased social brain response, reflecting the integration going on during the original narrative, whereas the kids with autism showed a weaker pattern of social brain responses. And what we think this means is that part of the reason that children with autism may struggle during longer narrative interactions and speech interactions may be related to how this social evaluative brain network processes speech across these longer timescales. In a second analysis, we examined connectivity, kind of this brain coupling between our auditory regions and this social evaluative processing, our default mode network here. And as I mentioned before, we think that these particular interactions between auditory regions and our social evaluative systems are important for not only for making sense of speech, but may be impaired in kids with autism. And so we directly tested this by measuring what we call functional coupling between our auditory regions and this network. And first, I'll show you results from this particular interaction between auditory cortex and this region here called medial prefrontal cortex. And you can see again for scrambled condition, both neurotypical kids and kids with autism showed very little or kind of weak brain coupling between these two regions. But in the narrative condition, we saw this large uptick only in the kids with autism. And when we looked in the angular gyrus, this other node of the social evaluative network, we saw the same pattern. And what this suggests is that the interactions that happen between our auditory regions in the social evaluative network, first of all, it appears to require a coherent narrative in order for these regions to show strong functional coupling in neurotypical kids. But it also shows that this coupling is weaker in kids with autism. And this also could be a neural mechanism that could get in the way of tracking speech information over long periods of time. And so I've shown you a whole bunch of results from several different studies, both in neurotypical kids and kids with autism. And I'd like to kind of highlight what we've learned about voice processing in autism. First, voice processing differences involve interactions between auditory cortex and social brain systems. And the brain systems involved in reward and social evaluation appear to be particularly important in the context of autism. Second, these brain systems change across development. And our preliminary data suggests that, again, important age-related differences in autism appear in brain systems involved in reward and social evaluation. Third, integration of speech across time in social brain regions is reduced in autistic children. And this could make tracking naturalistic speech more challenging for kids with autism. And fourth, these findings suggest specific neural targets for future research and intervention. One way to think about that is that this research helps identify the brain systems that may be most important for communication. And if future therapies or technologies are developed that can strengthen or support these particular brain systems, then studies like ours may be able to help point to the circuits that matter the most. Together, these findings suggest that differences in autism may involve how the brain integrates and interprets voices within social brain systems. So where is this research headed? An important area for future research is following the same children over time in what we call longitudinal research. All of the developmental studies that I've shown you in my previous slides here have been cross-sectional. That means we bring a kid in for one session only, and we bring in kids across a wide age range, 7 to 17 in those previous studies. But what's most powerful for understanding brain development is following the same children over time using a longitudinal design. And this is important, especially in the context of adolescence, because it's well known that some kids with autism show real improvement in social function during adolescence. It's thought to be kind of a critical period for them where they may be more motivated to engage socially. Sometimes they just don't have the social tools available to them to build friendships and strengthen those connections. But there's an interest, and some kids are able to improve in social function during adolescence, and other kids continue to struggle and have persistent difficulties with social communication during adolescence. And so it's important to learn, well, what are the brain systems and circuits that change in kids with autism who show these improved social function during this time, relative to kids that show persistent challenges in the area of social communication. And the only way you can study that is to track these kids longitudinally. This is a very difficult thing to do and get funded, quite frankly. And so, but we think it's absolutely a critical question to better understand autism development, in particular as it relates to social function. Another area that we'd like to continue studying is in the context of real-world conversations. Most of the brain research out there in kids with autism uses kind of snippets of speech or maybe sentence-level speech, but this does not fully kind of capture what people experience in their everyday lives. And I don't think we can fully understand the brain at work in its natural kind of behavior and the way that it naturally functions unless we're able to more closely approximate real-world conversations and real-world social interactions. So a third area involves understanding brain plasticity associated with social interventions. Many kids with autism show improved social function followed by interventions. And it remains an open question, what parts of the brain change following a successful intervention? And our lab has started to do this work, but we need to continue doing this and expand this research to better understand the plasticity underlying improved social function following an intervention. So in conclusion, I hope that I've been able to express and communicate some information about helping children with autism tune into voices. And a few takeaway messages I'd like to convey. Voices are powerful signals for social connection, and understanding how the brain responds to voices may help explain why tuning into voices can be challenging for some autistic children. And differences in how the brain processes voices may shape social communication differences in autism. And finally, understanding these brain systems may help guide future approaches to support communication. I'd like to thank the many amazing collaborators and members of the Speech and Social Neuroscience Lab who contributed to this work, and especially the children and families who made this research possible. I'm also deeply grateful to the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation and our other funding agencies for supporting this research. Thanks so much for your attention, and please feel free to ask questions now or email me later with questions if you'd like.
Well, Dan, I want to thank you for an outstanding presentation and just wonderful work that you're doing on such an important topic, the issue of communication, socialization for children, adolescents, adults with autism is so important.
Thank
Um,
you.
you mentioned interventions for improved social function. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about some of the types of interventions that are available to help people.
Sure. So there's a wide kind of, there's fairly broad um, kind of number and of ways of improving social, intervention, a bunch of different interventions out there. Um, the ones there's kind of a class that I'd like to highlight of social interventions that very much kind of plays into many of the themes that I've talked about during my talk here. Um, it's a class of intervention called naturalistic developmental behavioral intervention. It's kind of a mouthful there, but it's called, the acronym is NDBI, and important. And there are several different interventions that fall under this class that include um, pivotal response treatment, Denver Early Start model, and others. And the idea with this is, it was developed, 30 some odd years ago. And the idea is that these interventions help motivate kids to socialize through their natural passions and interests. So the idea is, if a kid is really into cars or sharks or whatever, then you use their interests in their everyday lives to help build social skills. And so this is an important avenue, we think, for intervention, and the research has shown that that it's that this kind of category of interventions, in many cases, has been more effective than ABA, and however, it's built on fundamental learning principles. So, and it's an evidence-based approach to improve social communication. The reason it kind of dovetails nicely with our work is, as I mentioned, it focuses on elements of reward and motivation in these kids. And we think that building um, that finding ways to naturally motivate kids with autism um, is a key to helping them, um, to helping build social function with these kids. And so again, there are other kind of areas and other interventions available out there. Um, but at the moment, the research shows that these natural developmental behavioral interventions, there's a lot of parent instruction, which is very useful. Parents are able to deliver the intervention to the kids all day long, instead of just a few hours at a clinic's office. And so this kind of type of intervention has really gained a lot of momentum in the field.
How would a person um, have access to that? Should if somebody's listening now and they want to really do this, how do they do that?
Well, I mean, I think the best thing you can do is to ask, if your child has contact with a child psychiatrist or school psychologist, or whoever you're working with, to ask about programs like pivotal response treatment, or Denver Early Start model, and to kind of mention these approaches, I think would be a good first step. Um, they've gained widespread attention in the field. It started small and it's gotten large, and it appears that this movement is, and this kind of this approach has gained a lot of momentum over the years. So I think contacting your professionals, healthcare provider associated with treating autism and diagnosing autism, that would be a good place to start.
Good, very helpful. I have a question. In your the initial studies that you described was 7 to 12-year-olds. Has there been work done at younger ages in terms of recognizing the mother's voice?
So we're unable to measure. So we would of course love to measure brain activity in much younger kids. The challenge there is that you have to be able to keep the kids still in the scanner. And what we've learned over many years is that 7 years old is about the youngest that you can get a kid to stay awake and be still at the same time. There are other studies that have done, what they call sleep study, where they have kids fall asleep in the brain scanner and then have them listen to sounds. But it's not entirely clear like what the brain is doing and capturing when the sleeping child hears sounds. And so that's a long way of saying, no, to my knowledge, there have not been any comprehensive studies of mother's voice processing using fMRI in younger kids to measure these all of these different brain systems. But we would love to do that. And maybe someday we can figure out how to keep kids still in the scanner to do that.
How long do they stay in the scanner when you're doing the test?
Well, it depends. We usually have, it usually takes somewhere between 2 and 3 hours to get all of the data. We try to break it up as much as we can into short chunks that kids can tolerate, and then we let them stretch their legs, and then we put them back in, and it's kind of a whole doing, as you might imagine. The whole process does take a few hours, and we need kids to be able to lie still and keep their head still for kind of 3 to 4 minutes at a clip. Or else if there's too much motion, then we have to throw out the data. That's why it takes so long to do all these experiments, because we wind up throwing out tons of data because the kids wriggle around. And some kids aren't really wired to lay still in a scanner. It's kind of a known limitation. Unfortunately, we're only able to study kids who are able to lie still in a scanner, which is only a subset of the whole population of kids we'd like to study. It's just another known limitation of the work. But yeah, so that's one of the big challenges.
Yep. Uh, the and understanding some of the basic science and the brain with this is useful because in addition to these social interventions, there may be other interventions that can be done targeting certain brain circuits as we learn more about it. Could you tell us about those other types of interventions that may be available?
That's a good question. Um, Let me think about that a little bit. I mean, I'm so focused on social function, but obviously for kids with autism, there are lots of, there's sometimes other things to focus on. Um, so language interventions can be, often kids with autism have, meet with speech language pathologists to help with elements of language development. And I guess one way to think about it is that, here I've talked all about social processing and voice in the context of social processing. But actually, when we think about important aspects of linguistic processing, for example, the use of pronouns, which can be tricky for kids with autism, and other linguistic elements, some of the brain kind of connections that I've highlighted may also be kind of important for targeting elements of language development in these kids as well. And so that's another type of intervention. I mean, it's a little, I guess in one way, I haven't really talked about language per se here. I've been talking about the voice as kind of a social, kind of orienting signal. And then, in the last part of the study, I kind of talked about integrating speech over time. But there's a whole series of linguistic processing that some kids with autism have trouble with. And so our brain model, where we think about auditory, voice processing interactions with other brain systems, may well be important for thinking about some of the language challenges that the kids with autism also face.
They and shift gears from voices to other sounds. Um,
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about the role that music can have or other sounds can have to help children with autism?
Music is just a fascinating topic, and my collaborator Dan Bowling and I are itching to study music more in the context of autism, because what's fascinating is that whereas kids with autism also often tune out from voices, these exact same kids are often really tuned into music and derive same kind of similar reward from musical experiences as their neurotypical peers. And so there's this initial question of like, my gosh, what's going on in the auditory system that allows kids to really tune into music in ways that they struggle with the voice? In fact, I had a mom tell me once, she said that she couldn't get her child to tune in to what she was saying unless she sang it. And so she would like sing to her kid to like put her seatbelt on. and
Hmm.
and if she sang it, then the child would get the message and put her seatbelt on. And so music is this fascinating topic, and we think about it. I mean, the way I think about it is in the context of reward. That there's some special access that music has to allow auditory connections in the brain reach the reward system and engage the reward system. And what is different about music that enables it to do it isn't clear. I mean, one possibility is that musical notes are longer than speech. A lot of speech sounds happen on the order of tens of milliseconds, like the difference between duh and tuh is just about 30 or 40 milliseconds. And so tracking speech requires much more fine-grained timing in the brain than tracking music, because even like the flight of the bumblebee, the fastest musical excerpts of that are I believe still on the order of hundreds of milliseconds, maybe 100 milliseconds. And so music tends to be much, much slower than speech. And so perhaps it's the case that that the temporal features of music allow a different type of a different level of processing for kids with autism that enable them to kind of access reward systems in ways that speech is not able to. But there's lots of nice music related evidence in kids with autism that music interventions can help reduce autism symptom severity. And again, a nice evidence-based literature has kind of developed to show some of these musical effects, and it's a topic that's fascinating as an auditory neuroscientist focused on autism. And it's also interesting to think about ways that maybe music engagement and music learning could help leverage and build social skills for these kids.
Well, Dan, I want to thank you for the work you're doing. Great presentation. And I'm sure we're going to want to have you back at some point in the not too distant future to get more of these results and learn more about what parents can do to help their kids. So thank you so much for the work that you're doing.
Thank you so much, not only for this opportunity, but also for the support that Brain and Behavior Research Foundation has provided me. It's a pleasure I love talking to people. I'm happy to answer questions. And Jeff, you can have me back anytime.
Good. Thank you. I
Thanks.
want to ask people who are joining us today or on a recording to please consider making a donation to BBRF. You can do so by visiting our website, bbrfoundation.org, or calling us at 800-829-8289. The webinar has been recorded. If you've missed any portion of the presentation or would like to share it, please visit the events and webinar page on our website. And please join us next month when we have another researcher speaking on our webinar on April 14th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. We look forward to you joining us then. Thank you. And remember, together we can dramatically improve the lives of those living with mental health issues and enable more people to live full, happy, and productive lives. Take care.